Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, I get to go into Never Never Land, as I've been in the radio business here for about 20 years and have discovered that if you stay on a particular path that certainly has heart, as one Carlos Castaneda would once say, you will find yourself embracing a horizon that simply will just take your breath away. I've been able to have the opportunity to meet and talk with people that, quite frankly, I thought life would never be long enough for me to be able to enjoy. Today is one of those opportunities that I get to have, as I get to speak with both Joan and Ann Watts. Now, some of you might think, well, who are these two? Well, for me, it actually embraces a special significance because as I was growing up in my early 20s, I decided my spiritual path should be that of Zen and Zen Buddhism. And that is where a particular mentor came along and said, one particular person you might be interested in reading about is Alan Watts. Now, Alan Watts was primarily responsible, if not significantly responsible, for introducing Zen to the West and being able to interpret Eastern and Asian philosophy. I get the wonderful pleasure of being able to talk with his daughters, both Joan and Ann, about a newest edition of a book called The Collected Letters of Alan Watts, in which we get a glimpse of who this person was behind the books that he actually wrote. So if you're a fan of Alan Watts, stay tuned, because pulling up your bootstraps, you're going to learn a lot more than you thought about this wonderful guru who really didn't like being a guru at all, but just simply a man of the world. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guests, Joan and Ann Watts. Joan, Ann, thank you for being on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now, when I got the opportunity to get this book, it's something that I've just been savoring. This is like a wonderful cigar that you kind of find in the humidor and think, I hope this can last forever. Now, what has this been like for you guys to compile these together and actually go out on a tour and talk about this whole thing?
Well, it's kind of thrilling in a way to be able to finally bring some basically pretty new material to the fans, former and the newer generation of people that are taking quite an interest in him in recent years. And I think it's timely. A lot of what he thought and wrote about is as true today as it was 50 years ago or more. And I think it was an interesting journey for us, certainly, to go through these letters and basically put them to print.
Now, we have a silent one back there.
Ann, are you there?
You don't get off that easy. You don't get to connect and say to yourself, I'm simply the universe quietly expressing itself, as your father might say.
Yes, but I do like that aspect. It has been an amazing adventure, I have to say. It's a tender adventure. It's so interesting. One of the things that's been really lovely for me is hearing from people telling their stories. And I heard from someone last night who wrote me that she had met a 25-year-old man, and she was driving him somewhere, and he put in a tape into her car, and it was Alan. And they were listening to him speak for a while, and she said, Who is this? And he said, Alan Watts. And of course, she knew me, and so she was just delighted to hear that. Yeah, sorry about this.
Well, sometimes it happens that messages just kind of come in the most unique ways.
I know. Really.
Now, as I was stating, as I was introducing the two of you, back, I think it was probably around 1987 is when I first began taking an interest in that direction of Asian philosophy and Eastern mysticism, and most specifically Zen. And so as I was beginning on that journey, I couldn't think of anybody I knew around me that could, kind of help guide me, if you will. And then there was just one friend I knew that I actually worked with, and I said, well, what do you know about Zen? He goes, I actually know quite a bit about it, so he kind of became my mentor. And so that's when Alan was first introduced to me. He says, you really should read his works, and he would tell me fun little stories about him. And I know one of the more interesting stories, if I may share this one, was, and I don't know how true this is or not, but apparently when Alan had died, he was cremated and put into this very special urn, I guess, if you will. It was sort of a rare urn, I guess. And I'm telling the story very loosely because it's been 30 years since I heard about this. And apparently somebody had broken into the home, and that was one of the things that were taken. And when his wife was asked about that, she kind of laughed, and they thought, well, what do you think is kind of funny about this? And she says, well, because Alan would have found that funny. And they asked, well, what for? He says, because in Alan's way, he would have just simply thought, because you never know where you're going to end up.
Well, that's kind of a stretch on this story.
Yeah,
because
again, yeah. I don't know. It was just what he told me, but it kind of stuck with me thinking, yeah, okay, even afterlife, you just never know where you're going to end up. And well, that got me intrigued about reading more about, his work and so forth.
The actuality of that story is that he was cremated in a funeral home in Mill Valley, and Jano, his widow, and I went to pick up the ashes, and it wasn't the urn itself was just a very standard urn, and however, Jano and I we opened up the urn and we each took a few pieces of the ashes, and she put them in a Tibetan necklace that had an amulet on it, and that was what was stolen. Her apartment was broken into, and that was stolen. And she also said that, it was going to be, I can't remember her exact words, but it was written up in the IJ or someplace about, well, this person will have problems in the rest of their life for doing this. So, that's more the real story behind that. But his ashes, half of them are interred at the Zen Center at Muir Beach, and the other half are interred up at where his library was.
Now, I will say this, when I was reading some of the letters here in the book, I think I found my most interest in him when he was a teenager, in the letters that he was sending to his parents and Mommy and Daddy. And I thought to myself, here's this guy who seems to be rich and complex in thought and expression and writing, but yet it made him so human, because we can tend to sort of idolize people to such a way that we forget that that's what they really are, is they're just humans, expressing themselves. And it was really fun to read things, when you come across, you wouldn't mind sending me a little bit more money, would you? Especially when he was in school. I couldn't help but keep remembering my own dad when he was in the military, and, his mom would say, I love you so, by the way, do you think you could send me some money?
Well, and I think it's amusing that the extra money was often spent on taking a bicycle ride somewhere for a pint of beer. So,
right. Now, how did you come
age?
Oh, go ahead.
That's all. I was just saying at the tender age of 15 or so.
All right. Now, how did you come to find these letters here?
When his widow died in 1992, we were the recipients of the bulk of his literary estate, and the letters were in cardboard boxes, all his correspondence and manuscripts, original manuscripts, and various other paperwork, royalty statements, and all kinds of stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of it had been in storage in Mill Valley in a storage company that got flooded in a year of high water. And so a lot of the papers were actually damaged, and we ended up hiring a gal that had worked for me at one time to go through and make sense out of everything and establish proper files and so on. So we ended up having about 2 legal-sized drawers of papers, packed with papers. And for some reason, I ended up with them. I don't exactly know why at the time, but I had moved to Montana, and they came with me to Montana and sat in my office for 20 years while I was doing other things. I would occasionally go into the drawers to answer an agent's question or a publisher's question about something, and noticed, of course, that there were letters, and occasionally I would pull one out and read it. And a couple of years ago, Ann and I visited with the editor at New World Library here in Novato, California, and they've been publishing a number of Alan's books that had been out of print. And during the course of our conversation with him, I mentioned that we had letters, and he perked up and he said, "Letters? And, have you considered publishing them?" And I said, "Well, yes, I sort of had thought that there must be something there that would be worth publishing." And he said, "Well, we'd like to do that, and we need to maybe find somebody who can edit them and so on." I looked at Ann and I said, "Well, I think we could do that." So that's how that came about, and we had quite a project on our hands because the letters, Alan, he wrote as much in his letters as he wrote in books. And
right.
So he had many letters that were mostly carbon copies of typed letters, often 3 pages long, of single-space typed letters. And then the letters to his parents were letters that they saved. They saved every letter he ever wrote them. And he died, his father died a year after he did, so you can imagine the number of letters there that were just wonderful because they were so descriptive of his life and what he was thinking and what he was doing, and it was a window to Ann and myself about our growing up as well, because he would talk about that too. And so that's basically how it came about. It was quite a job. We had to scan them. Some of them couldn't be. The quality was so bad, and they would have to be hand typed. But they were scanned and put into Word documents, and then proofed and reread. And when we got to the publisher with the final manuscript, there were 400 letters or approximately, and he said, "Boy, we might have to cut this back." And we looked at each other and said, "Well, good luck." So when he started reading it, he said, "I see what you mean. There's nothing that I would want to cut." We cut very few letters out of it.
It's pretty fascinating, too, to consider the fact that, he was such an at-length writer and personal correspondence as he was in his books. So you really get some glimpses, more than that, actually, real insight as to how his thinking was developing about the kind of message and the kind of things that he was putting out there. And one of the things that I was curious about now, one of his books that I read that I really enjoyed quite a bit, actually, and it was probably one of the last, was his own autobiography, In My Own Way. And I guess since I have the both of you here, I just have to ask this question because in his own words, he didn't feel that he was really of the father type or a very good father. How would you answer something like that? Or, what was that experience like for the two of you?
Well, yeah, I'm here. It was different for Joan than it was for me. and just in that she was the firstborn, and she was born when our parents were in the glow of their love for each other, and so she was very much a wanted child. And when I came along, I was not a wanted child, and so it was a very different experience for me. However, Alan, as a father in himself, he was a delight to be with when he was present. He was fun, he was playful, he was interesting. He encouraged us to draw because he loved to draw, and he just wanted to bring that out in us. So we have lots of wonderful memories of that playful side of him. The other side was that he wasn't available much. He was deeply into his work. He'd either be at the typewriter writing, or he'd be gone, and so that was a thread throughout our lives, which was difficult for his wives as well as for us. So I think he was aware that he wasn't as present for his children as he would have liked to have been, and I think that's why he said that.
Joan, any thoughts, insights on that?
Yes, well, I think for me, the first 10 years of my life, which was during the time he became a priest and was chaplain at Northwestern University, that was a time of, I would call it somewhat childhood enchantment. I mean, he, as Anne said, he would play with us, and when he wasn't busy in his office writing or whatever, he would be with us and draw pictures for us. We would have times on the beach at Lake Michigan and so on. And about the time when our parents divorced, I was sent off to private school, and so the only time I saw him was on vacations for the next 10 years of my life, pretty much. And then, of course, I got married, and so I lived in the Midwest, and he lived on the West Coast. So anyway, the basic childhood years, the early years were great. The teen years were pretty absent, and although when I did see him, he would impart certain types of wisdom to me, which were helpful, and that's pretty much my experience.
So, what was his wisdom when it came to dating?
I think that's X-rated.
Okay.
Sorry.
I could probably believe that coming from Alan somehow. Although I will say that he taught you to be very thoughtful, as I understand that you gave a special wedding gift when he married Miss DeWitt.
Oh, right.
Now, what was that all about? What was your thinking behind that gift? I thought, well, there's something nobody will ever forget.
Well, I was still a child, basically. I
right.
must have been 10. Yeah, I was 10 years old because after they were married, I was sent off to England to boarding school, and I thought it was a very cute little thing, and I don't know why, but it was, as I probably wanted it too. So it was, and it lived for a while. I don't know if you've read the letter. Once he was living in Millbrook in 1950, he had a party with a number of, Joseph Campbell and his wife were Jean Erdman, the dancer, and John Cage, the musician, was present. They had a weekend party, and then they slept over, and my father apologized to John Cage that the hamster running in the wheel all night would keep him awake, and John Cage says, "Oh no, it'll be music to my ears."
Absolutely. I know Mill Valley was one of his, if not his place, he considered to be heaven. And I remember reading, of course, in his autobiography, it was really an interesting, eclectic mix of people that he was around in that time and area. And I thought, it'd really be kind of cool to be around those kinds of people, in the way that they think and express themselves. And you could probably see to a degree how, although what he was writing about and studying about and talking about could kind of change and become colorful and interesting ways around people like that. Did you see a change like that?
Dan?
Well, I think the thing that I could experience, I wasn't around a lot during those years. That's when I went to girls' boarding school in England. But I was around at the beginning, and I felt him begin to relax more, and I think that the friends that he had at that time were a great influence in him letting go of some of the British reserve that he grew up with, and certainly he was surrounded by a lot of fascinating and colorful people. And so, Gary Snyder being one memorable one, and as Joan had said, John Cage and various other really interesting people. At my age, I wasn't really that conscious of the philosophical aspect of things that was being talked about. I heard it all kind of, but it just went right through me because it wasn't my, it wasn't my field of interest. I was really young, and I think, as we look back, we can think from the adult perspective, wow, it would be interesting to have been a fly on the wall or whatever,
Right. And it's funny, like you said there, Ann, when you're on the outside looking in, you think that.
Right.
And but just recently we had on the program a gentleman by the name of Eric Wiseman, who was Frank Sinatra's agent from 1977 until his death in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And he also was the agent for Liza Minnelli and just Sammy Davis Jr. and so forth. And he was really enjoyable to talk to. First, he had that East Coast gangster sound. But he was talking about in his book, as he was talking about Frank, and what it was like to be around him, about his son, Frank Jr., and he says, there's something people really should come to understand about celebrities or about being a lifestyle of this kind of magnitude. And I'm certain that it had to be kind of that way also with Alan as well, with you folks, is that people need to come to see that it's a whole different level of living. I mean, these are people that get out there and they put themselves out there. So the idea that they come home at the end of the day from the work or the job and bounce their children on their knee and spend time with them, as we tend to see in TV and movies, it just doesn't exist. And, he shared, for instance, one story about a frustration he had as he was trying to get Frank Jr. to actually sort of tour with his father, Frank Sr., and he couldn't figure out why the silent treatment. Finally, the son shot him some insight. He says, can you imagine what it's like not having dinner with your father from the age of 7? And here he was 38 years old. And he was literally saying, I've never really been able to spend time with my father one-on-one alone. And to be that person outside of this whole situation, seeing in, you wouldn't understand something like that.
Right, yeah.
I think that's somewhat true in our case. I know that whenever he would visit me as an adult, people, would always gravitate to him, and so my time with him would be somewhat curtailed.
Right.
And then when I moved out west with my family in the early 70s, it was just, I guess, 1970. It was the same thing. He would always be involved in some sort of conversation. I remember actually in '68 when I was visiting that I came back to the ferry boat from having been out someplace, and he was there in a meeting that I think was even being taped, I'm not sure, with Michael Murphy and Lewin, I think, was there, and somebody else. Anyway, it was just, I sat down at the table and I was kind of there and involved, but not involved. So.
Now, to give our listeners some more further insight about the idea that as you think of Alan Watts, and if you're a fan of Alan Watts, and you've certainly read his works, and certainly there are people out there that, they become disciples. That just can happen. What I always got a kick out of your father was he would sometimes, or a lot of times, write in ways where you'd follow when you're thinking sort of ethereally, like you're just floating along that awesome philosophy that you're hearing from somebody, and then he would twist around a corner and you would go, boom, he's just dropped you right back on earth again. And to give you an idea, I'm going to go ahead and read a brief passage in one of his letters, which was dated August 11th, 1951, just to give our listeners some insight as to what I'm talking about, because this is what always amused me, because this was the human side that I could even experience with him even back then. That way I wasn't taking myself so seriously in my Zen studies, I guess. And it says, Dear Jackie, it's about time I kept you up with the news, though you may have heard something of our doings through Ruth Goodkind, to wit, that on August 3rd, Dorothy produced 5-pound, 5-ounce Marcia Ruth Watts, a cute little bundle with a fine round head and deep blue eyes. Then yesterday, Joan arrived from London and New York, making our vast family up to 5 humans and 5 cats symmetrically grouped, since each class contains 1 male and 4 females. And he would do stuff like that when you would read his writing, like he's on this thing here and you're kind of following him up to the clouds, and then boom, he just tied an anchor to your feet and dropped you to the ground. And I always got a kick out of that.
Yeah. That was pretty amusing.
Now, how has it been received from people who you've certainly done, I'm guessing, quite a few interviews by now with what you've put together here?
What we're hearing from people is they are really loving the read. And someone interviewed us yesterday, and he said right at the beginning of the interview, I was so touched by what he said. He said when he opened the book, he was moved to tears, and he felt like he was being invited in to this very precious experience. And the way he said it was just so moving and touching, and I hadn't expected such a reaction like that. But we're hearing from people again and again how much fun they're having reading the letters and how interesting it is. And so it's wonderful. We've had some really great reviews, and I just think these letters are so very interesting and such a great read. They're easy to read, and they're colorful, and they're fascinating, and they're human, and they're real, and it's everything. And one person was saying he had never read Alan's books. He had only listened to the audio recordings and the YouTube recordings and stuff. And so he was thoroughly enjoying the reading. Alan's way with language is so incredible. It's really beautiful. And so, yeah, it's being very well received. It's really lovely.
Any insights from you?
I've had the same experiences that, people, there's, some Facebook pages that are dedicated to his writing and so on, and it's been overwhelmingly well received, and the reviews on Amazon and places like that are just incredibly good.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're very happy that people are enjoying it so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and it's beyond, of course, just his his writing, what he was putting out there. But again, back to being more insightful as to who he was, and it's just been really enjoyable what I've been able to read so far. Again, as I've been saying, I'm savoring it and getting back to remembering what it was like to read his works back. I think the last time was in the early to mid part of the 1990s, so it's been quite a while, but I'm really glad that the two of you were able to bring something like this out and give me something more refreshing to read, that's been very, very enjoyable, and I want to thank both of you for taking the effort to do something like that.
I think one of the people that we've actually met through our Facebook experience was saying that it took him back to that time, too, and refreshed his memory of what it was like to be living in the 60s and 70s. 50s, 60s, and 70s, I guess. And I think that's really true, too. We've kind of forgotten there was things going on in that time period that were quite beautiful. And you look at our lives now and how things are in the world, and although there were definitely problems back then, it seems like we've come cycled round to another era that was not so pleasant worldwide. And so much of what he had to say about people disconnecting with the universe. They think of themselves as separate from the universe, and that's just simply not true in his mind, or those of us who think more clearly maybe, that we're all part of this incredible universe, and what we do and how we live is very important, and that we take care of the planet Earth and all of that, which was some issue back then and is still issue now. So I think hopefully his writings, with the increased popularity, especially among younger generations now, will sort of be the paradigm for a shift in how people are thinking in terms of their connections with each other and connections with the Earth and connections with the universe.
Well, I just wanted to go ahead and share this with you, both of you here. I know that since I've been producing Beyond 50, as you say about changing and taking care of the earth and the things people are talking about, one of the biggest things you hear a lot about, obviously, is diet and nutrition.
Right.
And this will seem a little bit off, but I think you'll come to understand why I bring this up, is that as we do talks in those directions where we're talking about eating right, trying to avoid, genetically modified foods, things like that, I can't help myself, but one of my favorite essays by Alan was called Murder in the Kitchen.
Right.
And if you can glimpse into some of my shows, I don't know how many times I've brought that specific essay up, but it's been easily more than a dozen.
Yeah.
Over 15 years.
Right.
There's been my influence along with, many others, and I just thought I'd share that with you too.
Well, there's a great letter towards the end of the book to Gourmet magazine, and it's very amusing. It's pretty short. I could read it, but I don't know if you have time to do that.
Well, give us a couple of minutes, sure.
Okay. It's to the editor of Gourmet magazine, and this was written shortly before his death, March 12, 1973. If I were to have been told 3 or 4 years ago that I was to become a vegetarian, a fruitarian, and a nuts and cheese freak, I would have been horrified. For in those days I prided myself in preparing boeuf tartare, pâté de veau and croûte, papetons, Ding dong. These are all French things.
Yeah, those French in their language.
Yeah. And a steak and kidney pie better than anything to be found in London. But something has happened to our meat and poultry. The meat has become mere chewing stuff, and the poultry, in particular the breasts, has come to taste like papier-mâché. Some of my friends who are health food aficionados say that this is because I have ruined my palate by smoking too many cigars and imbibing too much spirituous liquor. This is not true. Several years ago, I imagined that this was the cause of my finding American potatoes, even the little new ones, entirely tasteless. But when, after 20 years' absence, I returned to my father's garden in England, the potatoes were as delicious as when I had been a child. So I have not destroyed my palate. The truth of the matter is that our edible animals are being raised in vast cell blocks under the superstition that almost anything fed, say, to a chicken will turn into a chicken. Why, they are even scheming to breed featherless chickens to eliminate the plucking process. So it just goes on. He talks more about some of the other things too. But I found that very amusing.
And he's absolutely right. I remember a couple of years ago, as I was living in Oregon, that we had a neighbor who had his own natural garden that he would go out to and he would tend to, and then he would, of course, one day he brought call it almost like a small case of tomatoes and a watermelon. And that was the first time, just like what Alan was saying, that I had tasted a tomato that tasted like a tomato that I remembered as a kid. And a watermelon the same way. They just don't taste the same. So he was absolute. Right. Food is not the same anymore. And so when I bring that up, in the interviews, people should read this because there was so much truth about what he was talking about then. Right. And one more to delight in, too, when you think of where we're at with social media, the Internet, and so forth. I just remember a particular thing I read where he talked about humanity becoming one single vast energetic unit. That's loosely how I remember him saying this, and I thought to myself, if only he were alive today to see exactly how right he was, 50, 60 years ago. It's pretty amazing stuff. And one of the best ways that I love remembering him, because I kind of also remember the way he ended his own autobiography in my own way, is that at the end of Murder in the Kitchen, he talks about how you would walk in and you would discover a letter saying, "The mushroom gathers up on the mount, whereabouts unknown." I want to thank both you, Joan, and Ann for joining me on the program. It really is a pleasure to have this. It's something I'm going to definitely be keeping by my bedside for forever. I'm certain of that, and I just thought you should know, yes, your father's been oft quoted on the radio show here.
Well, that's wonderful, and
great.
I hope that your
audience... Oh, by the way, Ann, you've got the right to remain silent. Sorry, your father's been a devastatingly humorous influence on me. I never took him that seriously, but when I did, it was fun.
Yeah.
How can people find out how they can come to get the collected letters of Alan Watts?
Well,
my favorite thing is to tell them to go to your local bookstore and ask for it.
There you go.
Because I like supporting local bookstores. You can
Absolutely.
get it on Amazon, and you can actually get it directly from our publisher, for that matter. But New World Library. But if you can, I always like to encourage people to support their local bookstores, and just ask them to carry it if it's not already there. And a lot of bookstores are already carrying it, which is really good news. I'm glad to hear that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I really appreciate your having us on, and it's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely, it's been fun for me. Believe me, like I said in the beginning, you don't believe life can be long enough that you'll have people like yourselves cross, for instance, my path, realizing this was somebody that I really enjoyed, years ago, and here I get to interview the daughters. It doesn't get any better than that. So you just never know where life's going to lead you.
That's very, very sweet of you to say.
It's been wonderful. Joan, and thank you so much for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's been a pleasure, but in the meantime, this radio host must remain silent.
Okay.
Take care. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, you can discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter so that you can stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.